Hey, what's up fellow Indian riders? If you have a 2014 to 2017 Indian with a power windshield and you have a rattle, I'm going to show you how to fix it. So when your windshield is in the up position and you can grab a hold of it and move it up and down, that's what's causing the rattle, and that's what we're going to fix. The first thing we're going to want to do is remove this cover, and we do that by first removing these two Allen head screws. With the two screws removed, we're going to go ahead and start prying back on the upper side of this cover. Kind of want to be very careful not to pry at the bottom because that's actually a tab. And if you just kind of work it back and forth, it'll release, and then you can go ahead and release the cover. Okay, with that cover removed, we're going to go ahead and remove these three 10mm screws that hold the headlight in place. Careful that when you remove the screws that you hold onto the headlight as you remove the last one, so that way the headlight doesn't fall and hit the fender. And with the screws removed, you're going to want to go ahead and separate the connector. Okay, with the headlight removed, we want to go ahead and disconnect the power for both the turn signals as well as the driving lights. And that's achieved by finding the connectors that go to these, and in this case it's a nice weather pack connector. So go ahead and pull back on the tab, and that separates that one. Find the one on the other side and go ahead and pull back on the tab and separate that one. And then the turn signals are these smaller connectors, and go ahead and use your thumbnail, push in on the tab. Sometimes they're a little bit harder, pull that apart, and same thing with this side. With your 4mm Allen wrench, go ahead and loosen the two screws that hold the speaker cover on. With the two screws removed, go ahead and just slightly pull the bottom of the speaker cover out and pull it straight down to expose the speaker. Now with your 4mm Allen wrench, go ahead and remove the 5 bolts that actually hold the windshield on. And be careful to actually capture the nuts that are actually behind it. Depending on how long your windshield's been on the motorcycle, you may find that the windshield feels like it's glued to the mounting surface. So go ahead and just carefully work both sides loose, pry the windshield loose, and it should come right off. With the windshield removed, we're now going to actually remove the outer fairing. There's 4 screws that hold it at the top, and there's 3 screws on each side that hold it down on the bottom. Now with the screws out of the fairing, we're going to go ahead and carefully lift the outer fairing off. Okay, now with the outer fairing off, we're going to go ahead and inspect the pivot points. The pivot points actually have a rubber washer sandwiched in between two metal washers. And what I found when I pulled the fairing off is that the rubber washer is actually tore. So we're going to go ahead and remove the screws and replace those rubber washers. Using a 5mm Allen wrench, go ahead and remove the bolts. And make sure that you capture both the rubber washer as well as the metal washer behind it. So let's get to the root of the problem. If you take the mechanism and move it up and down, you'll notice how the jack screw actually has a fair amount of play in the end of it. Because this is a pretty complicated mechanism, we're not going to take the entire mechanism apart. Instead, we're actually going to make up a couple of shims that we can shim the end of the jack screw against this outer cover, and that should take care of our problem. In order to get this plate out of the way so we can access the two screws that are holding this cover on, we're going to go ahead and actually clip the two tie wraps that are actually holding these wires in place. In order to remove the two screws that are holding this outside cover on, we actually have to remove this plate, which contains a lot of connectors. So we'll remove these two 10mm bolts. Okay, with the two bolts removed, we're going to go ahead and actually pry this out of here. Just be careful that you actually don't pull on any connectors and get any connectors loose. And once you do that, you can actually get in here with a screwdriver and actually remove these two screws. Now you have to be very careful that you don't actually strip these things. So use a lot of force in the end of the screwdriver and push up such that you can actually get the screws loose. And it always helps to have a magnetic screwdriver as well. Before I remove those two screws securing that outer cover on the jack mechanism, I used some feeler gauges to figure out how thick of a shim I needed between the cover and the end of the jack screw. As a result, I came up with some 20 thousandths spring steel shim that I'm going to go ahead and make the shims out of. Using cardboard like you'd find in cereal boxes, I went ahead and made up some templates for the shims. Here's the final product. Two 20 thousandths shims stacked together will make up the 40 thousandths needed between the end of the jack screw and the housing. Another option would be to take one 20 thousandths thick shim and put a little bit of a bend in it. The natural spring steel nature of the shim, with the jack screw pushing in on the surface, will actually take up any sort of play in that jack screw. Instead of using rubber washers at the pivot points like the factory did, I'm going to be using these wavy washers instead. Also, the two screws securing the jack screw cover will be replaced with these Allen head screws. So the wavy washer actually gets sandwiched between this bushing and this plastic washer. Okay, we have our two shims, and on the shim that's actually going to be the closest to the jack screw, I went ahead and I put some moly paste on that, and that's going to provide sufficient lubrication against the end of that jack screw. So let's go ahead and actually start with putting the closest one to the jack screw in. I'm going to go ahead and slide that in there the best that we can. Get that into the center. And then we're going to go ahead and try to feed this one in right behind it. I might have to play with it a little bit, maybe coming from the other side. got to be patient, kind of work it in there. You can even use a little bit of a screwdriver to kind of get behind it. And once you get it in there and it gets it right into that little notch, you know that you're good. Next, we're going to go ahead and actually take the 2 Allen screws, the 3mm Allen screws, and secure that cover. Just tight is good enough because that's some pretty soft material, and if you go too tight you could strip out those shreds and then you're out of luck. Okay, good enough. Okay, next we're going to go ahead and put the bolts in that actually hold the mechanism to the pivot points, and you just have to be careful and make sure you push down on that pivot a little bit and then kind of play around with it to kind of get them started. I would go ahead and actually get both of them lined up and started before you went ahead and actually tighten them down for certain. Okay, let's test it to make sure it goes up and down properly. First of all, let's see if there's any play in the mechanism. That actually looks pretty good. It's nice and solid. Once I put the windshield on there, that should actually be pretty good. So let's run it up and down. Moves up and down. Doesn't sound like anything binding. Doesn't sound like the motor's struggling. So I think that's actually going to be the ticket. So now we just have to put it all back together.